Welcome to SARC Talk. SARC is a nonprofit cancer research organization that develops and manages clinical research trials in pediatric and adult sarcomas. SARC Talk is a podcast to discuss activities of SARC, interview sarcoma research leaders, and review scientific initiatives in the sarcoma field.
Welcome to SARC Talk, episode number 14. My name is Scott Okuno, medical oncologist at Mayo Clinic and Chief Medical Officer for SARC. All episodes are posted on our website, Spotify, and YouTube SARC channel, or wherever podcasts are available. Please subscribe and submit any comments because we do look at them. It is my pleasure today to have Stephen Young, CEO of SARC, as my guest today on SARC Talk. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Dr. Kuno. I guess I'll call you Scott, right?
That's correct.
All right. I want to make sure we're on a first name basis. Always have been.
It's been a pleasure working with Stephen Young. He's been at SARC for some period of time, and this is his first podcast with us. So it'd be good to hear a little bit about our CEO of SARC. So with that, Stephen, please share with our listeners your previous experience as a CEO prior to coming to SARC.
Sure. Well, first to start off, I joined SARC 3 years ago, and I stepped into rather large shoes of my predecessor, Denise Renke, and a lot of the leadership that was going on. So my background is setting up and running oncology research consortia, first in multiple myeloma, and then for the last 10 years before joining SARC in lung cancer. So I had sort of ran the gamut of soft tissue and then obviously a very large group of solid tumor cancers. And when I joined SARC, I was really struck by several things. One, which is what an incredible group of people that not only founded SARC and have gotten it to the point where it is today, but quite frankly, as I mentioned, I came from two different other disease group, oncology cancer groups, and the esprit de corps, the sense of positivity among sarcoma investigators, clinicians, scientists, the esprit de corps, if you will, is extraordinary. There are really no sharp elbows. There aren't camps. Everybody recognizes the challenges and also recognizes, fortunately for all of us, the need to collaborate. And that obviously is the secret sauce of SARC for the last 21 years is why we were established. So I guess to make it a little bit about myself, I really was pleasantly surprised at how collegial the sarcoma research community was, and also appreciative of SARC's role, whether it's a big role or a small role, in helping facilitate and drive those collaborations, to leverage those. So as I said, I've been really struck by that we're all in this together, and meetings like at CTOS, et cetera, have really highlighted that. So the last 2-3 years, SARC has evolved rather rapidly as well, thanks to your leadership and Dr. Jonathan Fletcher, our Chief Scientific Officer, and of course your role, in case people aren't aware, as the Chief Medical Officer of SARC for the last 2 years. But you've also been our medical officer for, I didn't want to put the number of years on it, monitoring and leading our clinical trial effort. So long story short, I'm just incredibly honored and pleased to be here, and very excited about Scott, what SARC has accomplished, but more importantly, where we're headed.
Well, when we first started to get to know you, we didn't know you. We knew you as much as we could say in your role in other disease disciplines, running, the multiple myeloma and the lung consortium, and your expertise has really been helpful as we transition from Denise to yourself. You've been here now 3 years. The initial thoughts of collaboration were very collegial. Sarcoma community is still there. But over the last 3 years, you've had a better understanding of all what we do in sarcoma, and what has kind of surprised you the most during your 3 years here at SARC as CEO?
Well, first, to be clear, I'm a layperson, and so my next sentence is kind of out there. I sometimes feel, coming from cancers that had targeted therapies, where immunotherapies were impactful and TKIs, et cetera, were impactful, and genomics and precision medicine were the lingua franca. I don't mean to be critical. My biggest surprise when I came into sarcoma is how relatively poorly understood sarcoma was as a disease, the field of battle, if you will. And then, of course, the other thing that really I did not anticipate was the heterogeneity of the X number of subtypes. I heard lots of numbers, 70, 60, 30, 40, whatever the number is, almost like there are all these distinct diseases. And the last thing that surprised me, and this is a outcome of that, is there really isn't a brand identity for sarcoma that we can leverage. In lung cancer, people, the two big things, do you have a small cell or non-small cell? To oversimplify things. Obviously, the world's gotten much more complex in lung cancer and many of the other cancers. But with sarcoma, it's really the patients identified by their histological subtypes, and therefore the balkanization of foundations has led to me, a sort of a schizophrenic or lack of brand identity of what sarcoma means. So I think that's the thing that continues to flummox me, is number one, better understanding the disease, and SARC is obviously a player in that aspect. But the other aspect is, how do the foundations that are associated with sarcoma work more productively together above and beyond the Sarcoma Coalition? How do we actually get work done as a group, so that hopefully we can influence eventually, this probably won't be SARC leading the charge, but policy, so that the federal government is actually investing an appropriate amount of money into this group of very rare and sometimes ultra rare cancers.
You kind of hit the nail on the head. Is some of us that have been in the field for a long period of time, we thought we knew a lot, but we know less and less than we thought we knew in the past. The tumor heterogeneity, yet alone histology heterogeneity, is just the opportunities that we face in sarcoma quite a bit. And to follow up on your idea of where we are with a brand identity, SARC originally was known for its clinical trials, the career development of young investigators that want to build a career in sarcoma. We also have a developmental therapeutics research discussion that we have at our national meetings at ASCO and CTOS. As we start to think about who our audience is, I think it's an important aspect. And as you've had time to reflect and how other organizations and other tumors have responded, where do you think SARC's audience is, or who SARC's audience is, or where it should be?
What's interesting about your question, Scott, is the last two foundations are involved with were founded by patient survivors or caregivers. And that led to a culture of patient centricity, for good or ill, a patient centricity. But both of those foundations had a sister foundation, which was patient facing, and then an investigator facing 501c, so two sister foundations, one facing on supporting patients and hand-holding education and doing grassroots fundraising, walk runs, awareness, education. And then the other arm, if you will, focused on exactly what SARC does, which is the science and clinical advancements, advancing science to the benefit of patients. So I would argue, and this was maybe by design, SARC's immediate constituency, because we were founded by, and quite frankly for, to support the efforts of the investigator community. Our view really was, as you touched on, was about clinical trials and clinical trials operations and being the regulatory sponsor and collecting the data and centralizing the specimens. I think one of the things that became clear even before I joined SARC, and this was under Denise's watch, that we need to add a visibility to SARC so that it isn't only the investigators. Ultimately, obviously, all of our shared constituencies are the patients and families. And I think what we're seeing over the last several years is an evolution of SARC's visibility to the sarcoma patient and caregiver communities in a way that we just, quite frankly, didn't have. It was not due to anybody's fault. It was literally just the focus of what SARC was founded by and for. And under your leadership, under Dr. Fletcher, Jonathan Fletcher, we've, as you said, we've expanded. Under the so-called SARC science side, expanding not only our scientific steering committee and strengthening that and diversifying it, if you will. But all the work that you and others have put forth with the clinical trialist group and the clinical trials development committee, but also the multidisciplinary tumor board, the sarcoma centers registry that we're actively working on, is to me the linchpin of the greatest impact SARC's going to have, at least in the short term, on helping patients get to a sarcoma program that will actually be able to support and facilitate them. So we haven't talked very much about the sarcoma centers program yet. We're calling it the sarcoma centers registry, and the plan is to start populating this with what we're calling a questionnaire, a database that really will allow patients and caregivers and also clinicians, frontline clinicians, a snapshot into what strength, what resources a given center will have. And the reason this matters is it's putting sort of our hand where our mouths are, providing programs and services that actually help patients in a even a more immediate manner than helping to accelerate new, better disease understanding and new therapeutic interventions. So I guess to summarize, SARC is adding, not detracting from what we do as an organization for the last 20 years. And that adding sort of patient-facing programs and support is valuable as we work in concert with the histology-focused foundations, the MIB agents for osteosarcoma, the National Myosarcoma Foundation for LMS, et cetera. I'm not going to name everybody, the LMS DR Foundation. There are all these histology foundations. And I think SARC is learning to work more productively and proactively and collaboratively with them, not in competition, but as supplemental. And I'll close by saying all those groups that I mentioned point to SARC as vital to the infrastructure, because we are structured to actually accelerate advancements to their immediate constituents as well. So all in all, we are trying to evolve the model, but not lose sight of why we were founded in 2003 by the sarcoma research investigator community.
I didn't think about that. Most of these other organizations, as you said, started with a patient focus and build out. SARC started just the opposite. We started with the investigators, and we're starting to build out opportunities. You shared a lot of new names and maybe new initiatives, and we'll come back to that. But we have the opportunity to build on what we would call the Research Advocacy Council, and this is a big ability for us to move forward and engage with individuals that are engaged in their own research advocacy. And we had a meeting last month in California hosted by Dr. Naveed and Dr. Mascarena. And maybe, Stephen, you can share a little bit of kind of how that meeting went and kind of where our vision is of engaging more of the patient advocacy groups within SARC and also reaching out to other organizations.
A great question. And so the Research Advocacy Council was started under Denise's watch, and it's modeled closely on what the National Cancer Institute has done of training research advocates in the, if you will, the art and science of clinical drug development and how protocols are written, consent forms are written. So these folks were all volunteers. They are trained on, as I said, how a protocol and a study is written. And what we've done in the last year or two is actually been working to embed, if you will, those patients, those research advocates into the trial as early as possible into the life cycle, so that the patient perspective, an educated patient perspective, if you know, someone who understands how studies are written, can actually be hopefully transformative to the ultimate outcome of the trial by making them either better design trials or logistically more appealing, if you will, from a patient perspective. So I think that's the biggest outcome over the last year or two, is that we've actually been formally embedding, if you will, embedding in the sense that they join the calls with the investigators. It's not just, I sometimes use this term, the little kids table at Thanksgiving, where it's a check mark. Okay, we've spoken to the patients. We're actually incorporating them into the conversation. But by training them up front, they're not slowing down the process of saying, well, what's a consent form and why do we have to do X, Y, and Z, and why can't we just advertise the study as we wish, all the ins and outs of running a clinical study. So last month's meeting in Los Angeles, as you said, we were gratefully hosted by Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. And the year before that, it was hosted in Houston. So we're now having in-person meetings and quarterly meetings. And the reason this matters is we're actually diversifying not only the number of patient voices getting involved based on various histologies, which added 3 additional new members who are representing different forms of sarcoma, but actually translating that potential energy into kinetic energy, if you will, of putting them to work. So I think the Research Advocacy Council, or RAC as we shorten it, is fundamentally essential to informing us as we grow our strategies and to be more impactful as an organization, not only for patients, but also in the milieu of driving science and clinical progress forward.
Yeah, it was truly a great meeting, and I think you and I probably learned more about the passion and desires of that organization and how they really want SARC to be involved, and how we as an organization can incorporate the patient advocacy groups. And then also then we as an organization have committed to continue to work with the Sarcoma Coalition to help drive other histology groups that have need support. So we look forward to that. So that's part of our audience that maybe wasn't there 20 years ago when we first started. We're on our 20th anniversary, but this is something that we're continuing to build and continue to grow, and I think we'll see a lot more out of that. Since being here in the last 3 years, you've initiated a lot of things, and maybe you can share some of those initiatives that you are working on a little bit more in detail. And you talked about the registry, you talked about a little bit of the tumor board. You can talk about that. You can also then talk about our podcast, which we are doing as well. But are there other initiatives that you think that are really going to be the next step to move us forward to where we need to be?
I think I'll just use the word criticism. The criticism of SARC before my time and since our early stages was we were a little bit of an insular group, if you will, and that wasn't by design. It was probably a self-selection process where like-minded investigators decided to join arms. And I mentioned earlier in this discussion that I was struck by the collegiality in the sarcoma community. So everybody has great intentions and wants to work together. And quite frankly, SARC's reason for existence is to be that facilitator, enabler of cross-team multi-center collaborations. I think the interesting and still unmet challenge SARC will face is how do we better interface with the full gamut of sarcoma stakeholders, whatever that means. And that includes the federal government and state government levels and other countries. The other criticism of SARC was we're a little bit US-centric. And we take these criticisms to heart. Criticisms is maybe too strong a word, but it's really a better way to look at it is some of the sort of unmet needs that we can address. And so I think with your leadership and Jonathan Fletcher's and the Discovery Translation Committee and collaborations with the Fortress Group and establishing the inaugural the SAS meeting that was just held in conjunction with National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, in September. The theme here is expanding and inclusiveness, not necessarily the classic DEI type of inclusiveness, but making sure people know that we are not a closed sandbox where if you're not a member of the club or know the secret handshake, you can't work for. To the contrary, SARC has always been structured to work with the best and brightest. And our job is to serve as that catalyst facilitator going forward. So I think the most exciting aspect of what the new programs we're taking is increasing SARC's visibility to the sarcoma community, including the patients. I sometimes joke if a patient, it's not funny, but if a patient hasn't signed one of our consent forms that says you're part of SARC 032 or 037, they may not have heard of us. The SARC Talk episodes that you're leading with Megan Blaylock, who is one of our research project managers, the monthly newsletter, the semi-monthly newsletters we send out, the semi-annual meetings we have. All this is a theme to make SARC more visible, and at the same time make sure that we're not perceived as an old boys network in a closed shop. And lastly, all this doesn't matter if we're not actually advancing to our mission, which is advancing drugs and knowledge. And I like to say our output shouldn't be just publications. It should be actually helping to get drugs approved or new diagnostics tested and validated. And I think probably that's the greatest unmet need in sarcoma, period. And we have several trials that are, I'll just say, leaning towards positivity, which is putting wind in our sails. Because I still remember a talk given by Dr. Bill Tapp from Memorial Sloan Kettering, where he showed a list of the last 25 sarcoma trials. And I believe, if I understood it correctly, virtually none of them hit their primary endpoints. And so I think that's an endemic challenge for sarcoma. And it's really encouraging to see some of the collaborative projects starting to bear fruit. And as I said, having positive readouts. I don't want to say more than that because I can't talk about, none of us can talk about this yet. But this ASCO should be a very interesting ASCO in terms of sarcoma world.
You're right. Part of it is not only to be inclusive. And Stephen, if you happen to know the secret handshake, please let me know, because I don't remember ever seeing a secret handshake. But the reality is, you got to remember, many of us that were here for the last 20 years of SARC have a legacy, which is great. However, we have a huge amount of new sarcoma investigators that didn't know the origins of SARC, didn't know how we want to be inclusive. So I think what you're sharing with our audience today is our job is to reach out not only to the established people that have been in SARC for many, many years, but also bring new people into the fold. And I think we have some great opportunities and projects that are looking forward in 2024. I think people don't understand when you say SARC, they think it's some place in the universe and there is a physical location. We did have a physical location at one time. Our organization is very lean. It's very dispersed. And maybe you can share behind the scenes how you coordinate all the members of the team as we try to tackle the initiatives that we need to do for our patients with sarcoma.
Yeah, I think the obvious answer is the sort of the post COVID world, the breakdowns in this brick and mortar mindset. My last organization in lung cancer was a virtual remote organization. SARC became such about 6 months before I joined, where staff worked from home and we didn't have a brick and mortar office. I think everybody who's listening to this has gone through that same experience of the yin and yang of a virtual organization. I think from a SARC standpoint, it's been a huge positive that we've become a virtual organization. We have people in North Carolina, including Megan Blaylock, who's South Carolina, I should say, that's on here. We have people in North Carolina, Arkansas, Connecticut, which is where I'm based. We still have a fair number of folks based in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area. What that has done is opened up our ability to recruit talent wherever they are versus having to, if you will, mine or compete with the University of Michigan, for example, in the Ann Arbor area for good people. So I think one of the things we've really been struck by is I mentioned earlier, the esprit de corps on the investigator clinician side. We couldn't be more blessed, and I'd say all of us couldn't be more blessed. The fact that we have this team of really dedicated, one almost say overly dedicated employees who are actually working behind the scenes tirelessly to handle a lot of the operational aspects of our trials. So I think the fact that we're a virtual organization has led to a strength. It obviously has a downside as well, because you lose the coffee cooler, the coffee pot discussions. But the outcome is we can really bring in the best and the brightest and spread our word. And again, back to your comment about the secret handshake, it really wasn't a secret handshake. It's just this concept that it was the same investigators working together because that's just the way it was. And part of that was a reflection that our budgets are limited in some of our trials. We mostly focus on phase 1, 2, and a handful of phase 3 trials. So therefore, we have a limited number of sites. And therefore, there's this self-perpetuating perspective that SARC is a closed shop because we can only add 4 or 5 or 8 trials to a given trial. a given study due to budget limitations, quite frankly. So long story short, I think where we are is a healthier, a continually healthy, growing, evolving foundation organization that is focused still on the bottom line of advancing science, but recognizing that we need to evolve with the world as sarcoma world evolves, and also cross-pollinate with other cancers. I'm part of something called a Cancer CEOs group, and it's comprised of about 40 different foundations across the gamut. Some are classic mom and pop foundations raising $20,000, $50,000 and doing a grant, to the other end of the spectrum, where an organization raises 20, 30, 50, 60, 80, $100 million outside of this. So we all learn from each other, and I think that's really the paradigm here, is to be open-minded, listen to ideas, and learn. Not everything is reinventing the wheel. You can learn from others, and that's, I think, part of what SARC has been doing over the last several years.
No, we agree. And, the ability to pivot to a virtual platform has really allowed people to be flexible, but also then make sure that high quality people that want to do this work continue to do this work. Megan has never been quite willing to come online here with us, but Megan is our producer for this part. She does multiple hats, but she is, as you said, able to get things done from her management of the clinical trials, but also get all these podcasts buffed up, ready, and get people here. So we do appreciate everybody doing their job in this field, and I think this will allow us to continue to move forward. As we think about the trials that we have right now active, all of them are new investigators. And in fact, all the trials and concepts are actually from new investigators. So the world's out there. People are starting to understand that, yeah, we have a lot of ability and interest from new blood, as we would say. So we would encourage more activity, as always, because we want to be busy, because our job is to learn more about sarcomas and get more options available for our patients.
Hey, Scott, can I add on something on that last bit? There was also a perception that an investigator has to a prior perception, well earned or likely not, that an investigator brings a concept to SARC. It had to be fully cooked, fully formed. And I think that's the other thing that we can be very proud of, is the supporting infrastructure, not only the scientific steering committee and the expansion of that to add new young blood, if you will, to that, but secondly, the launch of the Catalyst program, where there is a supporting infrastructure for these young investigators that may not have access to a biostatistician or how to write a protocol. We basically are leveraging a lot of that strength. And I think that a lot of folks don't know that that exists. You don't have to come to us with a protocol ready and fully funded before we get involved. In fact, we just had a discussion this morning with an investigator whose concept has been approved, and we now are working collaboratively with them to identifying funding sources and handling the contracting. And basically, I want people to know that SARC stands ready. Whatever life cycle of your concept is, it could just be literally something you thought of in the shower that morning, or it could be something that is fully cooked into that spectrum. And again, a lot of the leadership that you bring to the table on the clinical investigator side, and Jonathan Fletcher and the Discovery Translation Committee, and we've got the we've got several groups that are all working in there. And as you said, the gist here is marrying expertise with energy. The energy of youth, the creativity, if you will, and the lack of perhaps knowledge on how to write a multi-center clinical trial. We have all that expertise, and we want to make that available to the sarcoma community. So bring your ideas. Our concept review committee is made up of Dr. Sandra DeAngelo from Sloan Kettering and Lara Davis at OHSU in Oregon. Please bring us your ideas. We stand ready to advance them. And the last thing I'll say is, and again, this is kudos to you and others, establishing a sort of an intramural star-making machinery where ideas can be generated within this group, and then as a cook, translate into sort of an operational side of SARC to actually implement on it, raise the funds, write the protocols, handle all the regulatory side, as opposed to only ideas being brought to us. I love the fact that what you're doing with the team and Brian Van Tine, and I'm not going to name everybody, of actually generating ideas. I think that's going to be the secret sauce to making a difference to the sarcoma world, both intramural and extramural concept generation.
what Stephen is kind of saying to us is this organization is very broad, it's very deep, and we have expertise in a lot of different areas that we do know. We were very blessed to have, Razmi Chugh, who ran the concept review committee for years. And then when she transitioned off, to have Laura and Sandra come in to kind of continue to build and to nurture concepts and to be willing to have concepts come in half-baked or fully baked, and then engage the appropriate people that need to help bring it to a trial. So I think we're really excited about the opportunities we have, and we do appreciate everybody's effort to get that done. Stephen, everything is rosy, it sounds like, but we always want to know, what keeps you up at night?
The biggest challenge facing SARC and many sarcoma foundations is access to the funds to support and drive these initiatives forward. I mentioned earlier that SARC was founded by and for, if you will, for the immediate benefit of the investigator community. Because of that, again, it's no one's fault. Because of that, our funding base was fairly narrow. It's based on transactional federal grants from the NIH or the Department of Defense, and or industry grants who will provide drug and funding for the investigator-initiated trials we're taking forward. And I think the biggest challenge for SARC is we do not have a philanthropic support base, a broad base where we get access to unrestricted working capital to invest in projects and concepts. That's the one thing I'd say that puts bags under my eyes and everybody else in this organization, is the stress of expanding and diversifying our funding base so that when an investigator does come to us, we are going to be in a position of saying, okay, this is going to be a $2.2 million trial, and the company X is supplying drug and company Y is supplying drug and funding, but we still have a $200,000, $400,000 funding gap. I would love us to get to the point where SARC can actually say we have working capital that we can invest into that. So I'd say that's the biggest thing that keeps us awake, and that's the biggest stress factor for our governing board of directors, and of course me and you as a member, as our chief medical officer, and others, to how to diversify our funding base. And I think the other stress line that I'm starting to feel more optimistic about is understanding the enemy, understanding the disease space that we're in. I see, as a non-clinician, non-scientist, an increasing uptake per some of the other oncology groups, oncology disciplines, of a more biologic disease focus. And so instead of, I'm sorry if this is insulting, but instead of throwing spaghetti at the wall and see if it sticks, there's more of a rational, a lot of science that goes underneath before we launch these trials. And the SARC 037 study under Dr. Patrick Grohar is a perfect example of that, of a clinical trial that's based on science, years of laboratory science, as opposed to learning to see what worked or didn't work in sarcoma, in melanoma, or any of the other cancer types. So I'd say a yin and yang is our concern is our funding base. We're working hard to expand that and diversify, and part of that was the lack of visibility of SARC to the sarcoma constituents, the patient communities. And then on the other side of the coin, I'm incredibly optimistic about where the sarcoma field is going. And then thirdly, convinced that SARC is a player in this milieu. We're germane, we're relevant, and we're continuing to increase that by expanding our reach and breadth and our ability to get things done.
You're right. It keeps us all, because there's so many things we'd want to do if we only had funds. And then we're much more disciplined in pursuing projects that have more science, but that also takes more money, as you know. You talked about our board of directors, and we're very fortunate to have a very active board of directors. Can you share with our audience kind of how you use a board of directors and also the operational team to put together this vision that you have for SARC?
What's interesting is when I joined SARC, the board was fairly MD heavy, and I don't mean that as criticism. We already have scientific clinical guidance. What the classic role of a nonprofit board of directors is governance, holding the CEO and staff's feet to the fire to be accountable for achieving organizational goals and managing our financials. So there's never any question about any of that, by the way. Uh, what has changed in the board in the last few years, and our board chair, Dr. Chappie Conrad, gets some of the credit, was expanding our board to include patient advocates, people that have either started up their own foundations, founded or co-founded, and or have a patient-facing perspective. So to that helps, if you will, enrich the dialogue and the vision setting for the organization. So it's less that I use the board than the board is holding us accountable, but above all, playing a role in our strategic planning, which is really refreshing. This is not a board that just is looking at our financials and saying, have you met your goals? We really have, and as you know, because you're a member of the board until recently, a voting member of the board, you're still involved in the board. We have these discussions on what the unmet needs are and what the gaps are. I think that's the greatest value of the board outside of its classic governance standpoint. And again, it echoes what's going on in the scientific steering committee of adding new and younger blood and different perspectives so that we challenge ourselves and not just float along doing what we do every year. All the new programs that have launched over the last 3 or 4 years is due to the fact that we were discussing them at the board level. And for example, the podcast, the SARC Talk series that you're leading was inspired by Anne Graham, who is the founder of MIB Agents, who's saying you have to be made more visible. Our newsletters is another example of that. I can go on and on. I think the board plays a key role from a governance standpoint, and it's very symbiotic and complementary to our scientific leadership and our clinical leadership, and then SARC's operational office of really getting things done. We're well positioned. And I have one last thing to say on that subject. Money is always an issue, but it's also, I was rather pleasantly surprised when we added up all the funds that SARC has raised and invested is the key word, into research over the last 20 years. And it's north of $75 million in sarcoma. So one could argue, would that 75 million have been invested in the sarcoma milieu with or without SARC? Debatable. But the bottom line is SARC has raised and invested a lot of funds to drive progress, and we've completed 26 clinical trials to date, which we hold the IND, when we're the regulatory sponsors of, which we could not have done without your role as medical officer. Long story short, I think SARC has a lot to be proud of, but I'm a big believer in not looking backward and looking forward, and I'm really jazzed and excited about where we're trending. And with these SARC Talk episodes, we're increasing our awareness with not only the patient community, but also the clinician investigator communities. And I'll close this little bit by saying we have a new member of our Research Advocacy Council whose son is a medical professional, actually a dentist, and she found SARC Talk, and she voraciously, these podcasters voraciously consumed them, and is now 2 days after consuming them became a member of our Research Advocacy Council because she recognized the value of what SARC Talk is doing of spreading the word, broad spectrum awareness of what's going on in the sarcoma world, but also appreciating the value that SARC is bringing to the equation. So her first name is Val, so I'll just call out Val. That was putting wind in our sails, and it's a real testament to the work that you and Megan have put into building this mechanism of spreading awareness of sarcoma advancements and who and what SARC is. And I'll close by saying it's not all about SARC. That's the other thing I love about this. This is not other than the fact that I'm the CEO of SARC and talking all about SARC, most of these podcasts are talking about broad topics of interest to the sarcoma field, period. And that's what I love about it. This is not a self-aggrandizement process. In fact, nothing SARC is doing is about self-aggrandizement.
You know, you bring up the point that the message of SARC podcast is to get information out to our broad audience. Megan and us have a huge amount of people we're lining up for 2024 that will dive a little deeper into the science, the studies, and more of you said the nuances of histology stuff. So I think we're looking forward to 2024. You talk about the board. You know, we have seen the board over the last 20 years evolve based on the needs of our organization. And I think our board and our previous board presidents have done a great job of getting us to the point where we've been for the last 20 years. The new board right now has really pushed us even to the next level. And I think we're very blessed to have them there and supporting and keeping us accountable, as you said, but they also help shape and direct. So this is, it's a good place to be at this time. So as we end here, Stephen, I know that we're not all about SARC. We're here to promote, sarcoma aspects. As people finish listening to this podcast, what vision do you want people to leave of SARC?
I think one of the things we have not done a great job at is communicating the I word, impact. I think not only has SARC a lot to be proud of, but we also, as a field, the sarcoma field, are, I don't know if this is an overstatement, and forgive me as a non-clinician, non-scientist saying this, there's a sense of optimism, but knowing that we have such a long way to go to actually make this all sarcoma patients have great outcomes. And I think that's where I look at it. We have to focus more as a field, all of us, on having greater impact. Publications are necessary. They're a part of the lingua franca of advancing science and clinical understanding. And I just think we have to focus more on the word impact. Are we actually advancing, improving patient outcomes, hopefully overall survival, certainly progression-free survival. So I think that's where all of us, the big challenge in a group of rare or ultra-rare cancers with an umbrella name called sarcoma, how can we actually create enough of a force to get the attention of Congress, to get the appropriate investment by the National Cancer Institute, appropriate from our perspective, more investment, so we're not fighting, if you will, over breadcrumbs of, the smaller amount. I think what we should do is learn and recognize that the so-called larger cancers, or even the non-cancers, like the HIV community did for AIDS, we have to be more visible, and that includes, marching on the Hill and et cetera. That's not going to be SARC's mandate. We're not going to be, the ones charging the hill, but we are going to hopefully be working in concert with the Sarcoma Coalition and the other groups that are actually moving that needle forward. So I'd say we as a field, we can't accept, we have to celebrate incremental steps, but we should be swinging for the fences. I don't know how else to put it. Really actually impacting patient lives so that they survive, thrive, and don't have to be listening to the footsteps behind them at all times, which too many cancer patients do, of disease reemerging or not responding at all. So I think we're well positioned as a field. It goes back to what I said at the beginning. There's a group of, this is a very large group of very, very intelligent people, and I view my job, SARC's job, as to get these smart people. How do we make it easy for them to work together? And I think SARC is well positioned to help that. But we know we're not all things to all people, and that we recognize that there are many players, including the cooperative groups and the Alliance for Clinical Cancer Research. There are a lot of groups working on this, all pulling on the oars together. I just think all of us need to recognize we need to be swinging for the fences and not looking for base hits. That's just my late summary.
Don't undersell yourself, Stephen. So we do appreciate that. So yes, SARC wants to make an impact in the lives of patients with sarcoma. We want to make an impact for our investigators able to do clinical trials, and ultimately to make an impact on the families and caregivers that support their loved ones with sarcoma. So with that, we end today. So thank you, Stephen, for sharing your insight, what we have on SARC and sarcoma, as someone who came into the field 2 years, 3 years ago with some vague understanding of sarcoma. You are now in the trenches, as we would say. So we look forward to continue work together in 2024 and beyond. So we appreciate it.
And I also want to close thanking you, Dr. Kuno. SARC is incredibly grateful for the leadership you have brought, Dr. Jonathan Fletcher as our Chief Scientific Officer, and of course, all the investigators that are involved in the various SARC committees. And please, if we're going to say anything, please join us. There is no secret handshake. We are all completely and utterly dedicated to advancing the sarcoma field. So reach out to us. We're here for you.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode of SARC Talk. To find out more about SARC, please visit our website at sarctrials.org. To suggest a topic or for questions, please email us at sarctalk@sarctrials.org. The SARC Talk series is made possible due to funding from Boehringer Ingelheim. Together, we can find a cure for all forms of sarcoma.